Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Quick Trump update. Well, I don't think that Elon Musk and Donald Trump will be making up anytime soon. And from my perspective, with Elon's reaction, him accusing Trump of actually being in the Epstein files, and that's the reason they weren't released, and calling for his impeachment, I'd say goodbye and good riddance to the muskrat. Now, I do agree with him that the big, beautiful bill is not a big, beautiful bill. It is big, but it's not beautiful. There's a lot of ugly in it. There's a lot of things that I'm hoping that the Senate can fix. They definitely should try. The situation out in California, I guess, is, from what I heard latest on the news, is calmed down some, but they have called in the Marines. They had some guard there as well. Now, I know there's issues with the question of constitutionality, and I'm not going to actually cover that tonight. I certainly don't have time to go into it before the show, but I will say this. The president, even though he has to follow the Constitution, he has to deal with these people, okay? These people, these are invaders. These are foreign invaders. These are people that are waving foreign flags. They're violating our laws. They're violating our laws just by being here. They're attacking federal agents. And even though I'm not a big fan of the federal government, you can't attack federal agents. Now, states cannot be forced to use their resources to uphold federal programs or federal laws, but they also cannot interfere. So he definitely has to be tough on this. Now, I don't know, maybe the answer is, California secedes and we build a DMZ along that border. I don't know. But I know that he can't just sit back and allow these people to do what they want to do. Now, I am concerned that we're not going to see only more of this in California, but possibly every blue city in the country. And I don't doubt for a minute that this is not only the communist, but I would say the Islamists are probably working with them on this, the Red-Green Alliance. So just be aware of that. Yeah, and hey, keep in mind, we've got some major cities here in Tennessee. We got Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, Chattanooga. They already have their problems. And oh, by the way, they already have communists there. They already have Islamists there. So just keep that in mind and keep your head on a swivel. Our guest tonight is Dr. Wanjiru Njoya. She is the Walter E. Williams Research Fellow for the Mises Institute. She has a law degree from Kenya, a PhD from the University of Cambridge, as in England, and is a fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. She taught for several years in UK higher education, including the University of Oxford and LSE. She's the author of Economic Freedom and Social Justice, Readdressing Historical Injustice with David Gordon, and You Stole Our Land, Common Law, Private Property, and Rothbardian Principles of Justice. That's from the Journal of Libertarian Studies 2024. Her most recent writing can be found at mises.org/Njoya and at abbevilleinstitute.org/Njoya. And she can also be found on X at Wanjiru Njoya. And I'll tell you what, if nothing else, go on X and read her post. She does battle every day with these people who have distorted history or only know distorted history, and she sets them straight every day, all day. It's great. So if you don't read anything else, go to X and read her post. Hey, thank you for being with us. I've been looking forward to having you on this show.
Thank you so much, Dave, for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Well, we were talking before the show, and I just read the titles to your book, and I brought up, I'm like, well, now, wait a minute. From everything I can tell, in my mind, from an American point of view, you're a conservative, and, you definitely are constitutionally minded. And when I read the titles, I'm like, maybe she used to be a liberal, because those titles really sound lefty. And we talked about that a little bit, but go ahead and if you could talk about the books just a little bit and maybe explain why they have those titles real quick, if you could.
Yeah, so the content of the books is probably the opposite of what you would think when you look at the titles. So the one that says redressing historical injustice, we're arguing that people are not entitled to reparations. They are not entitled to, you know, complain about what they call their historical grievances. They are not entitled to say, I'm suffering legacies of injustice. So ours is an argument against all those historical injustice arguments. I suppose from the title you may think we're defending the historical injustice arguments. We're not, we are rejecting those historical injustice arguments. And in the one, economic freedom and social justice, I'm arguing there is no such thing as social justice. It's a meaningless concept. Some of you will know because Thomas Sowell wrote a book called Cosmic Justice, where he's saying pretty much the same thing, that this idea of social justice is a made up concept that people use for political purposes. And I'm saying there's no such thing. There's only justice. Something is either just or it's not just. There's no such thing as social justice. And I say justice just means very simply to give each man his due. That's it. There's no more to justice than that. You get what you deserve. That's the principle. So as to why the titles are like that, that was to get it past the cancel mob. There are mobs out there who, if they see any title that sounds like it's going to undermine their narrative, they will absolutely go on the attack. They try to cancel the author and also try to cancel the publisher. That's to discourage publishers from touching these books and to make publishers think, because publishers are in it to make a profit.
Right.
So if they think a book is going to be trouble and the Twitter mob is going to come after them, then they don't want to touch it. So that's why the titles are like that. You also won't get your books in the library on the shelves if the title says rejecting social justice. No one's buying that for their library. So that's why the titles are like that. And also, you know, on a more serious note, because that's more to do with the marketing and, you know, getting past the council mob. But on a more serious note, I really wanted to reach students because when I wrote those books, I was teaching at university, and I really wanted to reach students who are not maybe politicized or they're not worried about political debates. They genuinely just want to learn. And that's the student I had in mind. I didn't want a title that is going to make students think, oh, this is just going to be more woke, anti-woke nonsense. Because actually the content of the books is very academic. And I really wanted, if a student was thinking, let me read about the history of justice, the history of equality and the classical ideal, I really wanted a student like that to be able to get the book out of the library and sit down and study it. And I was tracing the history of these concepts through the law back to Roman times and even beyond. And so I wanted to reach students with just the idea that this is a serious subject for serious study. It's not just about woke, anti-woke stuff. In fact, I avoided using the word woke in my books for exactly that reason. I thought I want these books to stand the test of time when we've moved on beyond this terminology that we're using at the moment. So that's why the titles have turned out as they are.
Okay, well, it makes sense. It's a shame you have to do all that, but it makes sense. So now, I'm just curious how somebody from Kenya and who spent all that time in England, how did you become a defender of the Confederacy and the South in general? I mean, I like I said on Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it, you really do a good job. I don't think Jefferson Davis could do a better job. So I'm just curious as to how that came about.
Yeah, I defend the South, absolutely. I'm always posting that title, The South is Right. Yes, the South is right. So why do I defend the South? Absolutely. So before I started defending the South, it started to do with defending the Confederate monuments. But before I got onto that, I was defending the British Empire because I know something about it and it's connected to my own history. And you found the same sorts of Marxist, communist activists saying the British Empire was evil and we want our reparations and the statues have to fall, just topple all the statues. These people were slave traders and, you know, they're evil, and any statue of white men, we need to destroy that because it's white supremacy, and just all the nonsense arguments you hear them using in the South. And I was robustly against that because I knew it was all political. And I used to say, I mean, I don't agree with the idea of empire. Let me start by saying that, with the idea that you go and you conquer people. But it's not the 17th century today. It's, you know, this is what they did then. And what I disagree with is this idea that you look back at history and you say, oh, look at the way they behaved in the 17th century. They shouldn't have done that. Therefore, it's evil. That's a really stupid way to look at history. So when I say defend the British Empire, I'm not saying go and get ships and go and conquer people and go and create an empire. What I'm saying is you defend the people who in the 17th century did what was right in the world as they understood it to be. We may look back and say they shouldn't have done that, but we can't turn back the clock. They did what they did, and it's wrong, in my view, for people to judge them. So that was my message and why I would defend the British Empire. So coming to the American context, to my surprise, I found that the same arguments people are using to demolish the British heritage, they're using to demolish the Southern heritage. Now, it's really interesting to me, and I know I've talked a lot about this on Twitter when I take aim at the Yankee hypocrites. It's really interesting to me that in the UK, in the British context, they just always refer to it as British. There isn't that divide that you find here, North and South, because of the war between the states. Because you don't have that in the UK. It's all the British are evil, the Scottish are evil, the Welsh are evil, the Irish are evil, kind of attacking the entire United Kingdom. So it was really interesting to me coming here to see that here the debate is more targeted at the South. And you often find people in the North joining in. This is, to me, it's preposterous. Instead of people standing together as Americans, you get Americans in the North joining in with evil communists to attack their Southern brethren. I just find this hypocritical and stupid. So that's how I began to defend the Confederate monuments. And then with the Confederate monuments, you also have another feature you don't find in the UK. So see, in the British context, all the statues are defended, all of them. You don't find people saying, well, he was good, he can stay, he was a slave, he needs to go. You don't find them distinguishing the statues in that way. So the other thing that struck me about the South was people tried to judge each person, whether they liked this particular person or not. So you find Americans from the North saying, we don't like Forrest, so he should go. And one of the messages I wanted to put forward was you can't pick and choose. If you defend the heritage, you defend the heritage absolutely. You don't start trying to judge each man based on what you might think are the moral standards that you deign to apply to people from the 19th century. So that's been one of my messages as to why I defend all the heroes of the South. Coming to the Mises Institute, I was so delighted to find that Murray Rothbard defended the South and the Southern cause in exactly the way that I'm describing. And he said in his defense, so the reason he defends the Southern cause is because he thinks it was just. It was a just cause. He's interested in justice, the idea of justice. But when he defends the Southern cause, he defends all the heroes of the South. That was the way that he put it. He said, Davis and Lee and Jackson and Forrest and all the heroes of the South and Dixie and the Stars and Bars, all the heroes of the South, not let's pick and choose which are the ones that we want to defend. So that's, I guess that's why my defense of the Southern cause has been so uncompromising.
And of course, the main issue is well, we hear that, well, hey, they own slaves. So that's the reason why we have to tear down their statues. And that's the reason why they were evil, because they own slaves. As if there was never any slavery in the North, as if no one in the North made $1 off of slavery, or every colony at our founding had slaves. I mean, but you don't hear that.
Absolutely, and that's why, going back to the British context, that's why they defend all the statues. They don't say, well, this one was a slave trader, this one wasn't a slave trader. That doesn't make any sense, because at the time, slave trading was legal. We look at it now, we say, well, it shouldn't have been legal. Well, okay, it shouldn't have been, but it was. And so you can't judge people by today's standards and saying that should not have been what it was. That is what it was. And so coming to the American context, and again, as you say, slavery was legal under the US Constitution in all the states. When the United States declared independence, there was slavery in all the states. There were slave traders, in fact, were Northerners. They were not Southerners. Southerners were not involved in the international slave trade. That was all done from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York. So it's the hypocrisy. I think you may have seen this on X. I posted recently an extract from Charles Sumner speaking in the Senate,
yes,
fulminating about slavery in the South as usual. And he was saying, never in the history of the world have we seen slavery as it's happening in the South, which is absolutely ridiculous, because his own state was a slave state. In fact, Jefferson Davis said in the Senate that Massachusetts slave owners were the most brutal of all slave owners. So it's incredible how he just memory hold that history and started fulminating against the South. And it's the hypocrisy that I think is dishonest and that we need to call out. Nobody, and there are no exceptions to this, nobody has got a right to judge history. Everybody's history has got things in it that you would look back and say, with hindsight, this isn't a good thing, but you can't turn back the clock.
Yeah, and I think a generation that has, for many of them, which have believed that abortion in any circumstances is a right, and people that don't recognize the difference between male and female, and we have so much perversion in our society today, I don't think that generation is fit to judge possibly any past generation. That's just my 2 cents on that.
Absolutely. It's the people, when you look at the people who purport to be moral judges of the past, and they have no morals themselves. They're the most, they're the most immoral people it's possible for us to imagine, and they're purporting to judge people from the past. I find this absolutely incredible.
Now, another thing, too, and I know you've mentioned this, and I've seen it on X and I've seen it other places, of course, is that, they bought the slaves were bought in Africa. Matter of fact, I think you had a post on this last night that you mentioned that fact that, hey, they were sold in Africa. They weren't captured in Africa. A bunch of scurvy-ridden white guys didn't get off the boat and chase down a bunch of black guys in the jungle. They bought them from other black tribes that had captured them.
Yes, and it's really important to keep on reiterating this, as I do at every opportunity, because when I make those posts saying, hey, wait a minute, these slaves were sold by their fellow Africans, when I make these posts, it's in response to dishonest people in our established media, in the press, in the universities, absolutely dishonest people who say, oh, look at these people that were stolen from Africa. No, they were not stolen. They were purchased. You can't blame the buyer while exonerating the seller. And that's the hypocrisy that I was talking about. They say things like slaves were bought. They use the passive language as if they were bought from nobody. And when you ask them, well, who were they bought from? They were bought from the Africans that were selling them. And by the way, this is another point that I often make. The slave trade did not begin when Europeans started buying. That trade had been going on for centuries, with Africans selling slaves to Arab slave traders. It was only after centuries that the first Europeans who sailed across to Africa saw this trade and thought, we should get involved in this trade. We can sell, beads and glass and whatever else they were selling in return for slaves. So that was a trade that had been ongoing, and people tried to forget that and pretend that it only started with the arrival of Europeans, and that's not correct.
Another thing too, and just kind of on this, kind of the last note on this particular point, was during the Constitutional Convention, when the issue towards the end of the convention was brought up about, stopping slavery, it was the Deep South and Massachusetts and the other New England states that were like, hey, no, we're not going to go along with ending slavery. I mean, they did agree to allow it to be let. They never mentioned slavery in the Constitution, but they did allow that after 1808, that, I can't remember the exact terminology, but they put it off that long. But it was the South and the North that got together on that and said, no, we are not going to do this. This is not going to be part of it, or we're out of here.
Yes, and many people don't know that the slave traders of New York, well, they were sailing from New York ports. They were illegally trading slaves until the 1860s. They never stopped trading slaves just because it was illegal for Americans to do this. They set sail with their slave ships from New York and just said, no, these are not slave ships, even though they were fitted out for slaves. So you get a lot of litigation around this because the abolitionists were saying, no, we think those are slave ships and we want to come on board and inspect them, and saying, oh, look, why have you got all these, chains if you're not going to Africa to buy slaves? And they said, no, we're not. I mean, you get case law from New York courts saying you cannot call these people slave traders without evidence. Just the mere fact that their ships appear to be kitted out for slave trade is not evidence of slave trade unless you find actual slaves in them. Then you have the evidence. But they didn't bring the slaves to America, you see. They bought them from Africa and sold them to, I don't know, Brazil or some other place like that, and then came back. So you never found the actual slaves in the ship, and so you never had any evidence of this trade that was ongoing. It wasn't a secret. People knew that this was going on. So the sheer hypocrisy today, where people try and pretend that slavery was a unique feature of the South and nobody else was involved in it, is total hypocrisy.
That I know of, there was never a slave ship under a Confederate flag. They were all under the U.S. flag.
Exactly. So there was never a slave ship that sailed under the Confederate flag. In fact, Plantation owners were not involved in the international slave trade. They bought slaves from New England slave traders. So somebody was trying to, one of these apologists for New England was trying to convince me the other day that it doesn't matter if the owner of the ship was from Rhode Island, and it doesn't matter if the ship sailed from New York, because when it arrived, they offloaded the human cargo in South Carolina, so that counts as a South Carolina ship. No, it doesn't. That's just offloading. The fact you're offloading in South Carolina or Georgia has got nothing to do with the ownership of that ship. They're kind of trying to distance themselves from a trade in which their own states were involved.
Yeah. And I think you may have mentioned this. I know you've mentioned it in your writings, but as the North as they got rid of their slaves, as they outlawed it, it's not like they freed them and said, hey, stay here and be a citizen and vote and, we want to keep you around. No, they sold them, and they sold them down south. They didn't keep them around. They weren't, hey, welcome to citizenship in Massachusetts. That's not what happened.
Absolutely. The hypocrisy is so off the charts. Even Abraham Lincoln, who inherited, his wife inherited slaves, and he was the executor. I don't know, it wasn't his wife, it was I don't remember who it was. Somebody inherited slaves, and he was the executor of the estate. So people say, well, they weren't his slaves. They were just the slaves that belonged to the estate, and he was the executor of that estate, so it doesn't count as owning slaves. Okay, well, fine, but he also didn't say we should free them, which is what he would have said if he was really against slavery. He said, sell them. So they got sold. I don't understand why people think selling slaves and getting rid of them by making a profit exonerates you from moral culpability. Oh, it was Robert E. Lee whose wife inherited an estate with slaves. That's right, because that's the comparison that people make, and they say, well, Robert E. Lee was a slave owner. Well, if you're going to apply the same arguments that you applied to Lincoln, then you would say, no, he wasn't a slave owner. He was managing an estate in which slaves had been left as part of the property of that estate.
Yep.
This is the other thing about the double standards. They will say anything to excuse northern slave owners while blaming southern slave owners. The other example is General Grant.
Yep.
Because people say, oh, well, he wasn't a slave owner because the slaves were owned by his wife's family. So his wife was really the owner of the slaves, and he himself only owned one. Well, what difference does it make if it's only one? You're still a slave owner, right?
Yeah, it's not like you have to have a certain number. One does the trick.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the double standards of where they'll say anything to excuse slavery in the North. And the other argument they bring up is, oh, well, but we ended it sooner. We ended it and the South was still slave owners, so therefore that makes us morally superior. No, it doesn't make you morally superior. That would be like a thief who was the first to steal, saying I'm better off than I'm morally superior to this other thief who was a thief later than I was. What difference does that make? The moral blame would still be the same.
Absolutely. And there were a lot of northern states that had they did not want freemen from the South, and there were quite a few freemen in the South. Matter of fact, there were black slave owners in the South. They did not want them to move to their states. So states like Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and I think Indiana, you have to post a bond that most white men at the time could not have afforded to post. And oh, by the way, just look the wrong way, do the wrong thing, and you're gone.
That's right. They banned Black people from entering into or settling in their states. And they think that in any way they are morally superior. In fact, many people might say, and some people have made this argument, that that makes you worse. If you say, in theory, I'm against slavery, but in practice, Black people are banned from entering into my state. Some people would say that that's worse than the South that embraced Black people living in the South. And that's another aspect of that I talk about the South. When I say embraced, it wasn't all conflict and hostility. It was a life. It was a hierarchical life, yes, where you had status distinctions between master and slave. But that doesn't mean that it was conflict. It just means it was hierarchical. I mean, if you look back to the history of England, you also had status distinctions, the master and servant status distinctions. And if you were a servant, that was your class. And if you were of the master class, then you had rights that people in the servant class didn't have. This is the way feudal societies were organized. So some people might say that that is a more stable and harmonious society than one where you ban people based on their race, which is what they did in the North. And I think what this shows is that looking back at history and trying to make moral judgments about who was better, who was worse. I mean, if you look at slavery in Africa, in West Africa, for example, they would bury slaves alive with their master. If the master died, they would bury him and throw the slaves in alive and bury them. So that's cruel. You can look back and find so many horrifying stories. When the British first went into West Africa, they were horrified at what they found there. So you can look back at history and the different things that used to go on, but trying to exercise moral judgment is always going to be fraught with difficulty. And I think many people have made this point that if you're going to measure it by reference to brutality, the American South wasn't the most brutal slave-owning society. It's nothing compared to Africa or the Arab slave owners, who were also absolutely brutal to their slaves. And we should just be glad we moved on from, living in such brutal conditions.
Yeah. What are some of the biggest misunderstandings about the war and Reconstruction? And of course, the war, we're going to talk about slavery and secession, and we know that the normal narrative is, well, the totally pure North fought to free the slaves, and of course the South, they seceded just so they could keep their slaves, which is all garbage. But that's pretty much the narrative. So let's hear your thoughts on that.
One of the debating all this with people on social media, I realized that one of the sources of a great deal of confusion is who started the war, who was the aggressor. Because when you know who the aggressor was, many, many other things become clear. And I think many of the mistakes that people make, it's because they think that the South was the aggressor. They think the South started a war, so they then ask themselves, why did the South start the war? They started the war because they wanted to keep their slaves. But go back, the South did not start the war. The war was launched by Lincoln. So the question is not, why did the South launch the war? Because they didn't. The question is, why did Lincoln launch the war? And the answer is very simple. Because he wanted to safeguard his tariffs. He did not want the South seceding. He was going to lose his income. He said, no, you cannot. He said, it's a union. You can't just leave. And when he invaded, I like to use the word invaded, when he
Well, that's what it
invaded,
was.
yeah, when he invaded South Carolina, he said it was to secure his tariffs. That's why he wanted to reinforce Fort Sumter. So many people think that South Carolina just decided to start firing on Fort Sumter for no reason. And that's why they say, well, maybe the reason was that they wanted to keep their slaves. No, the reason why they were firing on Fort Sumter was because Lincoln tried to reinforce the fort because he wanted to safeguard his tariffs. So that's really what the war was about. So a lot of time on Twitter is spent trying to explain to people why South Carolina, the Confederate government fired on Fort Sumter. Then the thing about secession, why do people say the South seceded to defend slavery? They're looking primarily at the secession declaration of Mississippi. That's the one that you will usually see people saying, oh, look, you can read it right there in Mississippi's secession declaration, because if you read that, they talk a lot about slavery.
Right.
That's why people focus on Mississippi and ignore all the other states. But even so, they ignore everything else that Mississippi said in that declaration. Then just kind of find the sentences that talk about slavery and ignore all the others. For example, one that I like to point out is when Mississippi said that no solution to the slavery issue had been offered by the North. You can't just tell people, free the slaves. Well, where are they going to go? This was Mississippi's point. There's 4 million slaves. Where are they going to go? Who's going to feed them? How are they going to subsist? And the North had no answer to that because, quite frankly, they did not care what was going to happen to them. Lincoln had this idea that they were all going to be sent to Liberia or Haiti and some other places. He thought he was even in talks with England that he was going to send the freed slaves to some of the British territories. But this wasn't a plan. Lincoln thought, that this would all be voluntary and they'd all be happy to go. It was just pie in the sky. And so that was one of the points that Mississippi was making. There is no plan. You just want to free the slaves, but you're not providing a plan that will be better than what we have at the moment. And that is in the secession declaration. Anyone can go and look it up. People just ignore that. The other thing people like to point to is the Confederate Vice President,
Alexander Stephens, yeah.
His cornerstone speech, so-called cornerstone speech. They call it cornerstone speech as if that's all that the speech was about, which it wasn't. But once again, what they take from that speech is that part of the speech where he says racial inequality and the superiority of the white race over the black race is the cornerstone of our Constitution, the Confederate Constitution, as it was of the United States Constitution. Because here was the point the Confederate government was making, is that it's about the Constitution, and it's about the principles on which the Constitution was founded, of which Alexander Stephens said that that was one. And he even spends quite a lot of time explaining why the superiority of white over black was in the Constitution as he sees it, as they saw it at the time. Of course, we don't see it this way now, but as they saw it at the time, they saw it as ordained by God.
But that was North and South. I mean, the
Yes.
attitude with between Stephens and Lincoln there was no difference in terms of superiority. I mean, that was North, South, East, West. And just to clarify something here, so now Lincoln made it clear that he had no intentions of interfering with slavery in the South, and he said that he had no constitutional right to. Now, later on, he did the Emancipation Proclamation, which really didn't mean a whole lot because it only applied to the places where he could not enforce it anyway. But the big thing before the war was westward expansion, and they didn't want slavery in the Western territories. Well, they didn't want slavery / they didn't want blacks in the Western territories. Well, when the South left, that took care of that question. They didn't have to worry about that anymore. So, and you mentioned the tariffs, and it's not just the tariffs that, okay, now the South would not be paying tariffs to the federal government, which it paid the bulk of them already. Not only that, now you would have a separate country to your south with ports that France and England would probably never go past again if they didn't absolutely have to, because that's who they were going to trade with. I think that was the bigger fear, was where are we going to sell our stuff? How are we going to raise any revenue? The South will ruin us if they become a separate country. Not just the loss of revenue from the South, but the loss from everywhere else.
Absolutely. And that was one of the points that was emphasized and highlighted in Britain and in Europe, whom, as you know, were primarily supporting the South, because they knew exactly, as you're saying, these were their trading partners, and that's what the North was concerned about. The South would be selling cotton to Britain and Europe, and they wouldn't have to worry about selling to the North, because why would they?
Right.
This was a concern. And you're just to go back for a moment to the point you're making about Lincoln, because I think this point is worth emphasizing, that everything Alexander Stephens said in his cornerstone speech was said by Abraham Lincoln. All those ideas about, that the races are not equal, that they cannot coexist, that they need to be separate, and that this is right, and that the white should be superior over the black. Lincoln said that repeatedly, not just once. He said it repeatedly. Like, this wasn't in the 19th century. This is what everybody believed, not just in the American North and South, but in Europe as well, everywhere in the known world. That's what they believed. This is not even an American idea. You can even trace it back into the earliest known writing in Europe, saying there are different races in the world and the white races are superior. So this is nothing. People who think this is some peculiar idea that only pertained in the South are completely wrong.
I listened to your speech today for the second time that you gave at the Mises Institute on May 17th, and it was Reconsidering Reconstruction, or Reconstruction Reconsidered. Can't remember which, but excellent. I encourage everybody to go listen to it. But you bring up a lot of good points about things that went on during Reconstruction and the total lack of concern that the North/Union had for the blacks. And I don't think you actually brought this up in the speech, but you mentioned Alexander Stephens a few minutes ago. I know that towards the end of the war, when it was, pretty obvious the South was probably going to surrender soon, Alexander Stephens either met with or had a correspondence with Lincoln, and he asked about, okay, if we do this immediate emancipation, because this was after the Emancipation Proclamation, this was after it was decided that slavery was going to be ended immediately, or here in the near future, that Stephens had concern about all of the blacks that would be freed, and a lot of them didn't have any way to take care of themselves. I mean, they didn't have property. Some of them had skills they could use, others didn't. And he said, well, what's going to happen to all these people? And the response from Lincoln was, root hog or die.
Yes, absolutely. And Alexander Stephens was genuinely concerned about this issue. He said that education was going to be very important. He wanted education for slaves to prepare them for emancipation. He had friends who were slaves. He was concerned for their future and how they were going to live. And this is one of the points I was emphasizing in that talk that you mentioned, was about the bonds of friendship and companionship and concern for people, very human concern for what was going to happen to people. And I think I mentioned there the speech of Jefferson Davis in 1848, when he said, this was when the North was saying, we don't want slaves in the Western territories.
Right.
They need to be confined to the South. And Jefferson Davis was saying, well, isn't it better for the welfare of slaves if
we can bring them with us to the Western territories?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly that. Otherwise, what's going to happen to them? And once again, we had this heartless language from the North. It was John Dix from New York saying, well, they'll just go extinct. They'll just die out. And so what? And Jefferson Davis said that he was shocked and horrified to hear this language. He said, these are people, he said, who've been domesticated in the South and there are bonds of companionship and of friendship and of devotion. And you can't just say, well, who cares what happens to them? Let them go extinct. So I think this is a theme that we see frequently in the South, was just this idea of concern. The Davis family, Jefferson Davis's brother, helped the slaves to set up a town of their own in Mississippi. So this is a concern that we see all across the South. And I'm really glad to have an opportunity to talk about this, because one of the things that really concerns me now with the way that people look at this history is to try and to shame people, to shame Black people for a history of slavery, and to say it was all brutal and it was horrible and that you should wipe this off your history and there was nothing good about it. That's wrong. I think it's completely wrong to wipe out anything good that happened in the past and pretend it was all brutality and fighting, because that's not true. And history is important in all its elements. The truth is important in all its elements. And because people only emphasize brutality, I thought it was really important to emphasize these elements of concern that we could see at the time for the welfare of slaves. And I think I talked a lot also about what happened to them after the war, which was a lot of hardship and suffering when the whole society was just disrupted, as often happens after war.
Well, during Reconstruction, we always hear, well, Reconstruction, that's when the Klan came about, and they lived and breathed just to go attack any Black anywhere that they could find, and you get a very distorted view of Reconstruction. And you did address that. As a matter of fact, you talked about the Union Leagues. You did talk about the Klan as well. So let's talk about that a little bit, because everybody's heard about the Klan, but a lot of people have no clue. I didn't know anything about it until about 5 years ago, about the Union League and how those were manipulated by the radical Republicans to turn them against all of the Southern whites.
Yeah, so that's a really important point. So one of the things that I always make sure to distinguish is that when we're talking about the Reconstruction era and the Klan in the Reconstruction era, that's not the same as, the 1920s, 1930s that most people know about from reading the news. We're talking about the Reconstruction era, which was 1865 till approximately 1877. It varied from state to state, but that's the approximate date of the end of the Reconstruction Klan. Now, the reason why it arose in the first place was for defense. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about knowing who is the aggressor, knowing who's launching the attack and who's fighting defense. And the reason why I say, so some people say, well, no, you shouldn't say that the Klan was fighting defense, because if you look at what the Union League did. It wasn't really an attack. But let's look at the nature of what they were doing, that people say it wasn't really an attack. First of all, they were arming the black people. Okay, they were giving them weapons. That's the first thing. Second, propaganda, telling them the whites are going to hurt you. You have to fight.
They're going to re-enslave you.
They're going to re-enslave you. You know, we want to give you money and property, but the whites are going to prevent that. They're going to prevent us from helping you. They're pretty much inciting them, you could say. Right. They would be marching. This is the other thing that I was highlighting. It wasn't just talk. They'd be meeting in the woods at night, planning, doing drills, marching, going to plantations, armed, making demands and saying, so here's the thing that the Union League would say, those plantations really should be yours. So go and get them. So off they arrive at the plantation. I've come for my land. I was told that this should be mine and I'm here to. When you look at this, no honest person can say that nobody would try to stand defense, right, that wasn't an attack, and that they had no reason to fear. They did have reason to fear. It was an absolutely volatile situation that had been created by the Union League. On purpose, they had deliberately done this, and their goal was to entice the black people to vote for them. And this was really important because that vote was valuable. Many white Southerners had been disenfranchised. They couldn't vote. So that's why that was their motivation to do it. They stitched up that vote for the next decade at least.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I mean, yeah.
Much
absolutely.
longer than that, yes.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they would even, if there were blacks that at that time who were not supporting what they saw the Union League and the radical Republicans doing, and if it was found out by the Union Leagues that a black was going to vote for the Democrat Party whenever they were allowed to at that point, I mean, they would go and intimidate that person. That person might be attacked, might be beaten up for, not voting the right way. Now, you always hear that about the Klan, that the Klan was out intimidating, and I'm sure that happened. I'm not saying it didn't, but nobody knows. It's as if the Union Leagues never existed. It's as if they were never armed. They never received propaganda from the radical Republicans, and that there was never anything that they did that was just like what the Klan in some cases did later.
In fact, they started it. This
Right.
is the point. They started it. Yeah. What the Klan is doing is a reaction to what was started by the Union Leagues, who, by the way, were planning this even before the war ended. Yep. They had it all planned, and as soon as the war ended, they were right in there rolling out their plan. The other thing about the Klan would defend black people who were voting for Democrats. Because if they didn't, those people were goners. If they tried voting the Democratic ticket, they would be attacked. You for those people who've read the histories of the Klan,
right,
there would be black families who were voting for the Southerners who would say to the Klan, if you don't come and defend us, we'll be attacked. So it wasn't just that the Klan were riding to intimidate
right.
Republicans, they were also riding to defend Democrats. That's what was going on in the South before the situation was stabilized in about 1877 or so.
Yeah, and that's why the Solid South was that way till probably the 50s, probably the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. It was the Solid South because people didn't forget it hadn't been that long. They knew that the Republican Party was. They hadn't forgot what the Republican Party did to them after the war with Reconstruction. And,
absolutely.
People that try to make comparisons today and act as if the Republican Party today and the Democrat Party, we're talking about it's a whole different time, and it's those are not legitimate comparisons when they say stupid things like, well, I haven't seen the Democrats so mad since we freed their slaves, or those stupid remarks. You see them all the time on X. These people have no concept of our history.
People are so ignorant. There's a really great article on the Abbeville Institute website talking about how this shift of the Southern vote from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and it just explains, because you have to know who the people were and what they stood for. And there's a really great, if anybody wants to know more about this, there's a really great article. I forget who it was, but if you go on the Abbeville Institute website, there's a great article on this shift from Democratic to Republican.
Well, now
also many great articles on the Abbeville.
Absolutely.
About what we're talking about with the union leagues and the violence, because it wasn't only the Ku Klux at the time. There were other militia groups that were
and they were all put under that heading, regardless of what they were called, regardless of anything that happened that was against the radical Republicans. It was all put under the heading of, well, the Klan did it. That's kind of how it happened. The other thing, of course, the Democrat Party from the I would say the 30s, really, the communists took over. They started taking over the Democrat Party in the 30s. By the 1940s, I would say they pretty much had control. Now, does that mean the average person voting Democrat was a communist? No, the average person voting Democrat didn't realize what his party had signed up. But most of the garbage that we are experiencing today and having to deal with as far as our overgrown government came starting in the 30s with FDR. And like I say, that's why people in the South now, the conservatives in the South now are Republican, is because the Democrats went communist. But the Republicans in the 1850s and 1860s were much closer to communist then than what the Democrats at the time were. So there's just so much, and I really wish I had 2 hours with you. We could easily fill up 2 hours. We've got a few more minutes, though. I do want to have you talk a little bit more about Reconstruction, and then why you think it's important. I mean, some people might wonder, well, why are we on X having these discussions about something that happened so long ago? I think it's still relevant and important for certain reasons, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
It's important for debunking the political arguments that people are making today in relation to civil rights, in relation to social justice, in relation to demanding reparations. Just yesterday, a couple of days ago, I was in a debate with some people on X who were saying they want reparations for the Tulsa massacre, as they call it, which were race riots. They want $100 million. These are the kinds of things today that make this history important, because it's the demands that are being made today are based on lies. So it's the demands for money. That's primarily what they want. But it's also the demands to destroy Confederate monuments, of which they've destroyed hundreds, and they want to destroy all of them. They have them all on a map. Here are all the Confederate monuments. We want them all destroyed. The Confederate battle flag. You have states like New York, California, where they say you can't display the Confederate battle flag on public state property. So these are the things today that people are saying that make it really important for us to show that this history is wrong. The Confederate battle flag, to show that the Confederate battle flag is not I don't know what they call it. They call it like a racism flag. It's not. It was the flag, the battle flag of the Southern armies who were fighting defense.
It's a cross of St. Andrews. That X on there is the cross of St. Andrews. It's a Christian symbol.
Yeah, so this is why talking about Reconstruction. Now, the other thing with demolishing the monuments, they say we need to get rid of Confederate monuments because it's KKK. So they like bringing up KKK. So this is why it's important to talk about the Reconstruction era and to tell what the Ku Klux was, so that when these people try to destroy other people's monuments and memorials by saying, "Oh, it's KKK." This is what they said in at Stone Mountain, the memorial, the memorial there, where they were saying that it should be allowed to fall into disrepair because it was KKK or whatever. These are things happening every day in politics, and that's why this history matters, and that's why it's so important to tell people that their understanding of the Reconstruction era is completely wrong.
And Arlington, for instance, and a lot of these others are reconciliation monuments. So years after the war, late 1890s, early 1900s, a lot of these were created as a, hey, we have officially buried, the hatchet. This is, you had Southern and Union veterans getting together, having these big reunions and saying, hey, we're all Americans now. And matter of fact, in the 50s, sometime in the 50s, I think, Confederate veterans were recognized as U.S. veterans.
Yes.
So when we start tearing down reconciliation monuments, that's like, what's that mean? Okay, we don't want to reconcile? Does that mean we want to fight some more? What does that mean? If you're going to tear down reconciliation monuments and dig up dead bodies, desecrate graves, that's the kind of garbage that's going on.
Absolutely. They're reopening old wounds. The destruction, the dismantling, I should say, of the memorial at Arlington, the renaming of the southern air bases, all these things, they are reopening old wounds because many people in the public don't know the truth. That's why the truth is so important. They get away with this because they tell lies. This is why it's so important to talk about the Old South, because when they took down the Reconciliation Memorial at Arlington, the federal judge who said, yeah, take it down, he said it's romanticizing the Old South. What does that even mean? The Old South, what it depicted of the Old South was true to what the Old South was. And that is what reconciliation was. It was saying we recognize that these are our brothers. That is what reconciliation means. Yep. Yep. And now you have a judge saying we don't want to romanticize the Old South. So it's really important. When they say romanticize, they're trying to imply that everything depicted on the Reconciliation Memorial wasn't true, but it was true. And they try to shame Black people today, like H.K. Edgerton and many other Black Southerners who talk about the history of those bonds between Black and white in the South, to attest to that truth that many people think is a myth. It isn't a myth, it's the truth. And that's why it's really important to talk about
mentioning it. HK, he's my guest next Monday night, and I'm looking forward to that as well. Couple things here before we close. We always hear the myth of the lost cause. Well, the cause number one was not slavery. That was not the cause. And I think Jefferson Davis, and you can probably say this, remember the exact quote better than I did, but he talked about the lost cause was actually the Constitution that the founders gave us. And that had nothing to do with slavery. It had to do with we had a written Constitution, we had representation, and that we were pledged to honor and uphold that Constitution. Anything to add to that?
Yes, Jefferson Davis said the Southern cause was the cause of constitutional government and of the rights of states and of the natural rights of man. And he said, which I think is important, this is not the cause of the South only. The cause of constitutional government is the cause of all the states in the United States. It's in every state's interest that constitutional government should be upheld. And this was the same point that John C. Calhoun had been making previously, that if you don't uphold your constitution, what have you got? This is what Jefferson Davis meant by the rule of law. It is upholding the Constitution and that compact between the states, because without that, see here, the thing that Lincoln was trying to do, and many in the North, in New England, was to say, well, there's a higher law. Yeah. If the Constitution doesn't fit what you want to do, you could follow a higher law. But this was the point the South was making is that if you tear the Constitution and throw it aside, you have no law.
Right.
You are now just in chaos and anarchy, which I think that is the cause of the South, and that's a really important point for everybody who oppose the rule of law.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I really, really appreciate you coming on, and I definitely want to have you back. We could easily fill up a couple of more hours. Definitely be reading you on X, and I would encourage, if you get on X and read what she has to say, go to the Abbeville Institute. She's got some great articles there as well as at the Mises organization. Listen to her speech on Reconstruction Reconsidered from May 17th. Excellent speech. Hey, I appreciate what you do, and once again, glad to have you, and hope I can get you back on.
Thank you so much, Dave. It was so great to be on your show. Thanks a lot.
Hey, thank you.
Appreciate it.
You have a good night. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night. I want to thank the audience for taking the time to watch our program tonight. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell, so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, and we really need your help to keep us on the air. Please subscribe and share us with your friends and colleagues. Check out our audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, teeninformer.com, and find and follow us on Facebook as well as X. A new feature we've added just a few weeks ago is called Dave's Raves, which are 2-minute audio commentaries on current stories and events. Expect at least a few a week, if not daily. Find them on our YouTube channel as well as our website. Yet another reason to subscribe so you never miss a release. Got an announcement for June 19th, 5:30 p.m. Central. The John Birch Society Peaks of Hope program will be held at 4188 Peavine Road, Suite 101, Crossville, Tennessee. Danny Blitz will give a talk titled Nullification, Our Duty to Interpose. Everyone is welcome to attend. You do not have to be a member of the John Birch Society to attend. No need to register in advance. Just join them. Our guest next week will be H.K. Egerton, the Black Confederate, for some more truth on the South and Reconstruction. The show will be at a special time of 4 p.m. 4 p.m. There will not be a 7 p.m. show on Monday the 16th. Our second show tonight will be featuring Colton Maccabee, a wrongly imprisoned J6er. He was the sheriff of J6 as he was known. You have to hear his story. That will start tonight at 8:30. Hope you'll join us for the next show and then again next week. That's it for now, and good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.